So having looked at the astronomy software that I used in examining the sites, initially Stonehenge, we'll look now at what I started to uncover. So looking beyond the idea that Stonehenge was just a site associated with sunrises and sunsets. So here's two plans of the site, phase 1 and phase 2. And we saw how in phase 1 there was an initial south-southwest entrance with this particular alignment to the south-southwest as seen from the centre of the circle, and how by about at least 2600, if not a bit earlier, the entrance was closed, and instead a new timber setting was placed looking at an angle out of the southern entrance, almost at the same angle as that which had been lost. But on checking, you do realise that the angle is not the same. It is in fact more southerly. So let's say it's aligned on something that has moved, so it can't be a landscape feature. It's out of the position that I mentioned before, out of the kind of the butterfly-shaped limit of solar and lunar settings and risings. So therefore, something that moves but is outside of this, it has to be a star. That was my reasoning. Now, if it is a star, and that star had moved over a number of hundreds of years, then an observer standing at the centre would no longer have been able, if it moves along the horizon, the observer would no longer have been able to see that star through this entrance, because the star is now rising here. It's been obscured by the bank. So the question is, why not just extend the entrance, cut away at the bank? Well, maybe there's some kind of taboo. The monument by this time is 500 years old. You're not going to just start cutting things down because the view has been obscured. Perhaps they try and find another method of re-establishing that new sightline. And this is, I argue, what's happening with these timber posts. That what they're doing is creating a new sightline towards those same stars which have moved, which doesn't involve demolishing part of the monument, which may have been the equivalent of a grade 1 listed prehistoric building. We don't really know how these monuments were viewed, whether they could be, how altering the monument would be seen. It's perhaps easier to block that entrance and to re-establish a new timber setting. So that seems possible, that the entrances and the new timber setting are focusing on something that has moved. So the next question is what the astronomy software comes in. And what I did was I started off with Stonehenge, but then started looking at a number of other sites, seeing whether they too had orientations or anything in the southern part of the sky, i.e. outside of that solar and lunar zone. And I started to find a large number of sites, quite important sites, large henges like Avebury and Stonehenge, others in the Stonehenge area. And actually, the further afield I got, the more I found this was the case, that there was orientations to the south, but not directly to the south. There's hardly any direct orientations to the south. But you find in archaeological literature that a lot of archaeologists say that these henges or structures are oriented roughly north-south. Well, they possess the ability, if they wanted, to align things exactly north and south. So why not exactly? Why either side? Now here's some examples of this orientation. So There are a number of sites. A sanctuary at Avebury. This is Stonehenge, Fargohenge, Woodhenge, Avebury, Newgrange Pit Circle. There's loads of sites, including these ones in Yorkshire, Thornborough, and other associated sites. All have this seemingly not quite southerly orientation. So what are they looking at? There's obviously method in their madness. So here's this was my initial list of sites, and you can see a rough correspondence in the orientations. They're not exact to each other, but that's because the sites aren't on a level plane. They're all, there's hills in the distance, there's different landscape topography. So if they're trying to look at the same point in the heavens, the same rising of a star, that star is not going to rise on the exact same position on the horizon in every location in the UK. Sometimes there's going to be a hill in the way or trees. So there's going to be slight variances in the orientation of the entrance to catch that heavenly body on the point where it's rising. So the slight discrepancies between the orientations doesn't mean there's no alignment. So what were we looking at? What was a heavenly body that seemed to be involved? First, I wondered whether it was Alpha Centauri, but then it seemed to me seemed more obvious that it was the stars of Crux, the Southern Cross. Now, this was the same constellation that we saw was involved in the alignment of Wayland Smithy, with the kind of entrance of the tomb. So it perhaps had a death and rebirth symbolism, and these same stars were embedded in the Milky Way, and it seemed to be their rising and setting points, which was referenced at Stonehenge. It's a setting of Crux that I first noted, whereas sites like Thornborough, it was the rising of the same constellation. What I also noticed was a kind of correspondence between the local topography and the stretch of the Milky Way. Because Crux, the Southern Cross rises, is in the Milky Way, then when Crux, for instance, is setting at Stonehenge, then the Milky Way is going right across the heavens and actually joining the northeast and the southwest entrances, like the handle of a basket. So it's almost as if when you walk into the henge, you're walking through the Milky Way or into the Milky Way or even out of it. There's a sense of it's like a rainbow bridge, like in Norse myth, and it's a link between the earth and the heavens. But it was also linking the topography of the landscape, because the River Avon also followed a roughly similar course. So the river in the sky, which is how the Egyptians called the Milky Way, and the river on Earth are seen to match up in the layout. Now, if we look out the southern entrance of Stonehenge in the first phase of building, 3100 BC, we see that Crux here fully rises. There's a bottom star just there, like sort of mark it like so. It fully rises at the point that marks the southern entrance. It then goes across the sky and then sets into the southwest entrance, and this is 3100 BC. So the southern and the southwest entrances are marked by the rising and setting of Crux. Now you could say, well, it could be any star, because a dozen stars rise and set in that position at that date, but none as bright as Crux. I mean, Crux is really dramatic. I'll show you a slide of it in a moment. But here in 2600 BC, we see that same setting, but now framed through those timber posts seen through the southern entrance. Because what's happening, the crux is now setting here, so the former entrance, which is over here, is now redundant because the constellation no longer sets into it. That's why they have to build this row of posts pointing kind of at a skewed angle towards and framing that constellation, that kind of steps. And this is crux here. It's in the Milky Way. As I said, it's possibly seen as a kind of diamond shape or kite shape, which is an important shape in Neolithic art, as we'll go on to say. But it's in the bright band of the Milky Way, and right next to this dark cloud that's known as the coal stack. So maybe this is seen as an important part of the heavens, and that's why the site is aligned on it. It's the same constellation as Wayland Smithy, and the entrance to Wayland Smithy was aligned on. Again, dictated by the rising points of certain stars. Now, so having found this evidence at Stonehenge, I started to look at other sites, finding, for instance, that from the obelisk at the centre of the southern circle in Avebury, crux would be seen rising over Wadden Hill and then setting over the place where they would, in the future, 100 or a couple of hundred years down the line, build Silbury Hill. So they're marking out, this seems to be a special kind of orientation, with crux in the Milky Way being part of this. And the more I looked at it, the more it seemed to be that entrance stones or entrances to henges or tombs seemed to be aligned with the Milky Way when crux was either rising or setting. So here's Brinkettley V on Anglesey, Nunwick in North Yorkshire, and here at Yavering, which is the site where I think in the earlier section, hopefully, although I'm recording it later, I will talk about Orion walking over the hill. So in my conception, the entrances of the henges seem to be the point where the heavens and the earth touch, meeting the band of the Milky Way. So to stand at the entrance of the henge was perhaps to enter some sacred liminal space, or even to enter some stargate into the sky, or for spirits living in the sky, perhaps ancestral spirits, to be able to come down to earth and communicate with the living. There was also the fact that at the time the henges were built, about 3000 BC, about 500 years either side of this, the Milky Way would also ring the entire horizon at certain points of the night. And this may be where the whole idea of the circular white ring of the henge initially came from. It's like an analogue of the Milky Way on Earth. Now, having looked to the south, I then started to question the fact that if you're looking from outside the henge, perhaps you're not looking south at all, you're looking to the north. And perhaps there's an equivalent. How do we know that we're not looking one way rather than the other? And anyway, I thought, a lot of these henges, you have entrances opposite one another. So if one is looking at crux, what is the other looking at? And this was the another point in the Milky Way, as I've said, and more especially the constellation of Cassiopeia, which is on complete opposite side of the sky to crux. So much so that the two have a kind of seesaw relationship. When crux is rising, Cassiopeia is setting, and vice versa, and sometimes within seconds of each other. Where there's differences in the height of your horizons, it might be within sort of half an hour, but still it's going to be a dramatic effect. Important stars in the south in the Milky Way are rising, these other important stars in the north are setting, or just scraping the horizon. Depends how far north you are. further north you go, Cassiopeia doesn't actually set at this point, just grazes the horizon. And that's why you have a lot more sites which are aligned directly north than you do sites aligned directly south, because Crux never rises exactly to the south. But Cassiopeia does graze the horizon to the north. So here you can see the two sort of in opposition, complete opposite sides of the sky, both within the Milky Way. And here is an example of a site where the northern entrance is aligned on where Cassiopeia is just setting below the horizon. This is Thornborough in North Yorkshire. And you have other sites such as Stanton Drew, where the alignment seems to be on Segin, which is the end star of the W of Cassiopeia, where that scrapes along the horizon of the hill to the north as the constellation rises again. So you're kind of watching the star go down and just scrape the top of this hill. Now, it's too dramatic for it to be coincidental, so it happens in too many places. So we're led to believe that there is a deliberate attempt to capture that stellar event on Earth, and that's why the henge is placed where it is. Here's the alignment with Orion at Yavering, which I mentioned before, so I won't do that again. But here's a list of the sites that I looked at in my study. There was about 50 sites, about half a dozen passage graves, and henges. I just flicked past that slide I wanted to see, and I can't work out how to get back. But basically, I'll draw it for you. If we look at the alignments of all these sites, remember I talked about the butterfly shape. What we actually find is that the majority of these sites are pointing north and then south, with another kink around here, which is to Orion, which I won't go into too much in this lecture, but the majority of these sites are pointing towards Cassiopeia in the north and the Southern Cross to the south. All the details are in my thesis, which is available online, but here are lists of my results. So we can see that midsummer, there's hardly any rising or setting alignments with midsummer sun. A few more with midwinter, but what's really important are the alignments to the rising of Crux and the setting of Crux, and which corresponds to the setting of Cassiopeia and the rising of Cassiopeia. These are the May Day ones and the Orion, which I'm not going to go into too much. But when we look at it in the form of pie charts, we can see the majority of these sites are looking at Cassiopeia and Crux. So when we put them together, we're only looking at about a quarter of the sites that don't have these alignments. So it's amazing, really, that this hadn't been noted before. But then again, people didn't have the software to really try to analyze what these sites were aligned on. The Orion alignment, Cassiopeia, Crux, and Orion, you can see that only 15% of sites don't show any kind of alignment at all. And some of them may have been damaged, and some may be later. But what we're left with is a kind of beginnings of a drama suggested in what the sites are pointing at. I'll go through this quickly. It seems to be a midwinter rite, and it starts first thing in the evening when Orion rises to the southeast, followed by Sirius just after sunset. So the sun is setting here, and then Orion is rising just about the same time. Now, as Orion reaches its highest point in the heavens, the Milky Way lines with the southeast entrance of the henge, if it has a entrance. And at the same time, the Milky Way is aligning northwest entrance of the heaven. Now, as Orion sets, this is when the Milky Way rings the entire horizon. There's Sirius, there's Betelgeuse in Orion, and at this point, the Milky Way is ringing the entire sky. This might be sort of the base point for the rest of the drama. Cassiopeia is setting in the north at that point, and Crux is just rising in the south. Then Crux rises, culminates, and then sets. I'll probably go through this in person for a later lecture because this section is taking a bit too long. Basically, it's what we're doing is seeing Orion go across the sky, then Crux rising, Cassiopeia setting, Crux goes all the way over the sky, sets, and Cassiopeia rises. And that's what is being highlighted by the orientation of these sites. But what does it mean? What does it say about ancient belief? What was the role of the Milky Way? That's questions which we will start to ask.